webpage you're talking about, let me do a really quick share screen just so you can see what I am looking at there. So we talked about the webpage that you did. Is that this link right here?
That is it.
Okay, because I was looking through it yesterday, and you
Mhm.
had mentioned that you had some of your early writing on this. So I was just kind of scrolling through stuff and looking for your name. I mean, I can obviously see
Mhm.
it right at the top here, but
Mhm.
what I did yesterday is I went into the section, I guess the one dealing with the stories and everything, and I was kind of
Mhm.
scrolling through and looking for your name. And I didn't see your name too much in here. So these are mostly other guys' stories in this area?
Yes, mostly they are. There's two in there. There's two pictures in there. I mean, two stories in there. One is actually a letter that I wrote home.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if I sent you that before or not, but I wrote a letter home and I put that up. And it was in the middle of writing that letter, I found out about my best friend being shot down.
Hmm.
So
So
there's letter.
yeah, there's a section called letters. So it's probably in there, I'm assuming.
So mine are under letters. I think both of mine are. One is a letter home about when my friend Reg Cleve was shot down, and the other is when I wrote a letter home and told my parents about when I got shot.
Okay.
So both of mine are in letters.
Okay. And do they have your name on them? Do you recall?
Should have. Let me let me check that out. And
Okay. I'll scroll through. Now that I know where to look, I started going through this and just wasn't exactly sure where to go. It looks like some of the letters there maybe don't have names on them, but we can figure that out later. I just wanted to make sure I was looking at the right stuff and everything there. Okay, so maybe today. So I was kind of thinking back to last week, and we obviously got talking about a lot of different stuff. I don't know if you were speaking chronologically necessarily, Carl, or if you were just kind of following a theme and sort of going off in different directions. So I wasn't 100% sure where the best place would be to pick up. I did have a couple of questions I wanted to ask.
okay,
And I wanted to start with what just came up in class the other day. We had the donut dolly there, and you mentioned that you had flown donut dollies around. I'd love it if you could tell me about a couple of those experiences that you might recall.
sure. Yeah, it was nice to hear her say that she was operating out of July for a while, and she shared a picture of going from south to north, right outside of Chulai, just south of Chulai, of the beach. And I got a picture that's almost identical to hers. So it was a beautiful sight. It was a beautiful beach. It curved around and then it ran into a rocky coastline where division headquarters were and where she would have been staying. Yeah, we would. A donut dolly mission was one of those kinds of missions that we all fought over trying to get it, because it was, yeah, you could get shot at on a donut dolly mission, but probably not because we were generally going to fire bases or places that were real secure. Occasionally, we would take them out into the field to where a unit kind of was set up in the field. Um, so we would pick them up at division headquarters, and we uh, we were 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, and we would immediately become 14-year-old when these girls would go start coming towards the helicopter. So if they were wearing skirts, one of the guys I was flying with, he was in charge. Uh, he pulled a little bit of collective pitch while we were sitting on the ground. which changes the pitch of the blade, which forces the air down and then forces it right back up. And if those young ladies were wearing skirts, it would be up around their neck, you know. So that was how we welcomed them. Too bad, you know. I look back on those things and realize how immature it was, but it was fun at the time.
And just so you know, there, one of the other donut dollies I met last year, she said they were ready for that, and they all made a point
They
of,
were,
yeah,
yeah,
they didn't
you
just
could
have
see them
panties
trying to
on.
hold them down,
Yeah,
but
they,
it was
well,
too much.
yeah, I guess she mainly talked about, they would climb up towers and whatever, and the guys would always be behind them. So
Oh yeah,
they had great big underwear that they would wear to protect against that.
don't blame them. You know, these guys, some of them had been, and us, you know, we hadn't seen any American women. It had all been Vietnamese women, which they were beautiful. Don't get me wrong. There was plenty of beautiful Vietnamese. It's just they weren't American. They weren't what we call round eyes. And so this was a big treat. Um, the other thing I had one pilot do that I was flying with, there's a thing that you do where you kill the power to the engine, you know, not completely. You turn off the fuel and you fall. You enter what's called auto rotation. You're just falling through the sky, and it's about 4,500 feet per minute descent, and it's shocking if you've never had that done before. It feels like you're fixing to crash. And so I remember he chopped the throttle and we went all the way down to the ground almost before he recovered. And then we flew low level back up the highway to July. So there we were, young guys, always trying to do something to impress, you know, the donut dollies or maybe give them a little thrill. I'm sure they got tired of that kind of stuff. But it was a special mission because the guys on the ground, this was a treat for them. They got to talk with these girls and various things. I'm sure you've heard from them what they did, and everybody was very appreciative of them.
And what about on the ground? Do you remember doing, any of those games or seeing any of the performances?
We would drop the donut dollies off and head for another mission and go back and pick them up later. That's basically what we did.
Okay, I was curious
Mm-hmm.
about that. Um, so in terms of other things we wanted to talk about today, one question I had, I mean, you talked a little bit about your getting wounded. You didn't tell me too much about your time in hospital, and I'd be kind of curious what your own experiences were, dealing with the medics, dealing with
Mm.
recuperation.
Yeah, when I got to the hospital, they carried me in on a gurney. I was let me see, I was shot in at the intersection of the top of my leg and the crease there, basically the top of my leg and the left cheek of my buttocks. It was about a 4 centimeter, I don't know, 4 or 6 centimeter wound, I don't know, but it exploded open the flesh. So so there was a lot of dead flesh in there that they were going to have to carve away. Anyhow, let me get back on track. Um, they carried me in on a gurney. I went into the operating room, you know, where they took these people. It was at the 27th MASH, and we called it the 27th Surgical Hospital. There, it was busy in there. There were doctors and nurses working around a couple of tables, a couple of gurneys, kind of like they wheeled me in and cut my pants off of me and began to, you know, examine me. And because the bullet was so close to the sciatic nerve, I was in unbelievable agony. And I had flown back, it was about a 15-minute flight to get back. Immense pain. I'd never experienced anything like that before. So as soon as we got in there, I started begging for something for pain. And the medic that was helping me, he said, you have to have a doctor uh, authorize that. And I said, well, get me a FN doctor, you know? And he pointed over to that busy area right over there beside me. And he said, there's all the doctors right over there. And they were working on a couple of guys who had tripped um, a booby trap that was an artillery round. The enemy had booby traps. So a lot of times artillery rounds and bombs didn't go off. And if they could get to them, they would make, and particularly it was easy to do the artillery rounds because we didn't go looking for those bombs. We did go looking for, but they would make booby traps and shoot us with them or hit us with them. So these guys had done that, and so I realized they were in a big situation there. They weren't going to see me anytime soon. So I asked, could I smoke a cigarette? And he said, yeah. I smoked at a time. So there I am in the operating room smoking a cigarette. Screen door, you know, flies buzzing around. It was Vietnam. And I waited for 4 hours. And while I was waiting, a bunch of my friends came over. They took pictures. I was laying on my stomach. I was naked from the waist down for sure. They took pictures. I don't know. I never got any of those pictures. But I remember at that point, I started bleeding. And I really hadn't bled before. I mean, there was, when I got shot, I was wondering did I really get hit, or had maybe like the bullet hit the armor plate and stung me, you know, a piece of armor plate or something. There wasn't a lot of blood, but I definitely had been hit. So then it started bleeding for the first time, and it was just trickling. It wasn't a big deal. And then after about 4 hours, at that point, I forget. At that point, one of my crew members or friends came up and he said, when we looked at the helicopter, we had an expression that came out of flight school. I guess was the first time I heard it. That you were so scared that you would suck the seat up your butt. You know, that was a pretty common expression. And they told me, they said, we were checking out the aircraft and there was a big hole in the seat, but there was no blood. So we figured that you hadn't been shot really, that what had happened is you just got so scared you sucked the seat up your butt. He said, but then we were looking in that hole and here's what we found. And they handed me an AK-47 round that had hit me. And it was missing a little chunk right out of the tip of the bullet. It was a copper-coated bullet, you know. So there was a lot of laughing and teasing going on about that. And then they took me in and they operated on me and they cut out all of the flesh that had been basically killed by the bullet, and then sent me into a ward. And I was there for about a week. And that was an experience in itself, being there. It was a lot of pain. I had an open wound, so they were going to leave it open to make sure there was no infection. And they packed it with gauze every day. And every day before they packed it with gauze, they would yank out the old gauze that was in there. And of course, the lymph and everything would have set up, and it literally was ripping it out of there, and it was extremely painful. I got one guy to actually soak it a little bit with hydrogen peroxide before he yanked it out so it wouldn't hurt so bad. But the nurse, she was a captain. I remember her so well. She would never do that because they weren't supposed to do it that way. They were supposed to just rip it right out. I had a guy next to me on my left side, and he had been shot in the leg with a bullet, shot through and through in his calf. and they had it packed solid with gauze. And he watched them yank the gauze out of my, wound every day. And then he told me, he said, man, I hope they don't do me like that, because his was packed all the way through his leg. Let me tell you, when the captain came in there, she took a pair of forceps. She hooked onto the clamps, and she hooked onto the gauze, and she just yanked it straight out of his leg. And I'm telling you, he levitated. It looked like he literally rose about 2 feet off the bed. He was quite a character. He sneaked out of the hospital and went to the club, to the EM club, and got drunk one night. He got in trouble over that. I had a lot of difficulty because I could barely walk, and trying to use the bathroom was the hardest thing. I had to lower myself down with a strap, which they had in there for people like me, so we could use the bathroom. The guy to the right of me was a really nice fella, and he had I think he had an appendectomy or something like that, but he had just had surgery for a problem. It was not a combat wound. And I guess one of the experiences that I will remember very well, there was a one medic, and he obviously was on heroin. And he came to me one day, and he began to talk to me, and he had to hold his head back to look out from underneath his eyelids. That was number one sign that he was pretty high on dope. And he began to tell me stories. I won't get into the details of that, but he began to tell me stories, and he set me up. He got a hold of me, and he set me up on my rear end in the bed, which that hurt a lot, and I remember him doing that. And then I remember another time he came and got me, and this was after I'd been in there for about 4 days, and they were going to take me, and maybe it was 5 days, and they were going to take me back to the operating room and sew me up. And he came and put me on a gurney, and he wheeled me up to the nurse's station. And I just remember snippets of this because they had already given me a shot to make me drowsy. And I remember the nurse saying to him, "You should strap him in. He's not strapped in." And I remember him saying, "Look at him. He's so high. I'm just going to take him by the hand and float him down to the operating room." He's quite a character. Of course, he did wheel me down there. And they sewed me up, and I think I was out of there in about a day after that. They sewed the muscles up internally with stitches that would dissolve, but externally they put in 12 wire stitches, and they clipped them off, but you got little fine wire stitches, and the ends of them caught in everything that I wore. It was pretty uncomfortable. Just having those stitches in there was uncomfortable. And they left those in there for probably about 2 weeks. So I didn't do a lot of walking around during that time. I couldn't sit very well. I just mostly laid on my stomach. And friends of mine and my roommate went to the mess hall and got me chow and things like that. Anything that I needed, all my friends took care of me. They were going to send me to a convalescent center, I think in Cameron Bay. My doctor's name was Dr. King. Funny how you remember those kind of things. And I asked him, I said, "Why do I need to go to a convalescent center?" He said, "Well, you just your wound needs to be checked every day. And that's typically what we do is we send people to the convalescent center. And I'm going like, well, I'm not going to know anybody there. It's life in the military medical facility is not fun. It was not fun. Um, so I asked him, I said, why do I have to go? And he told me, and I said, well, look, I'm friends with the company commander's driver, and I can get a ride over here every day. It was all the way across post from where I was. And he said, well, if you can assure me that you can get a ride over here every day, then you can stay in your company area. So I was fortunate enough. That's what I did. And we had some experiences in that too. Another thing I'd like to say about when I was in the hospital, there were two guys there who were from one of the units that I worked for, the 1st and the 52nd. And I'm thinking that they might have been the two guys that they were working on when I got in there. There was one wheeling around in a wheelchair, and he had been operated on. He must have had shrapnel in his chest. And they had cut him from his navel up probably to about here and then across, like they do when they're operating on someone's heart. So he had that all stitched up, and I'm not exactly sure why he was in a wheelchair. So then his buddy was laying in a bed, and his legs had been hit pretty bad. And I don't remember what else. I just remember his legs, but he couldn't get out of the bed. And the guy in the wheelchair went up to his friend, and he took a large match, a kitchen match type match, and put it between his two toes, his big toe and the next toe, and he lit that match. And so there's his friend laying there in the bed going, trying to blow the match out that was at his foot before it burned him. So I didn't know what was going to happen there, so I blew the match out for him. But there was all kind of crazy things going on like that. Guys were badly wounded. We had a guy in there who had lost his leg, and they changed his bandage during the night. And he would scream and holler. Oh my goodness, poor fella. Uh, the other thing was that there were a lot of guys in there that were wounded a lot more severely than I was. So they would come in with chow, and there would be one guy who would go around from bed to bed to bed to bed in our ward delivering the food. So it was a long wait for some of those guys. So I would get up, I could hobble around, and I would get up and I would get trays of chow and I would deliver it to the far end, so those guys wouldn't be last, and get the chow distributed out a lot faster. I felt good about doing that because I was so lightly wounded compared to so many other people there. Then the other experience I would say was actually after I got out of the hospital, and I was going back every day. So every day after I got inspected, then I would go around the wards and I'd look to see if there was anybody in the beds. I could go to the end of their bed and read their chart, see their name and what unit they were with. And I'd check to see if any of the guys were from the units that I resupplied, the ones that we supported. There were basically 3 battalions mainly that we supported. We supported a lot of others, but primarily these 3 battalions. And so it was about the middle of the second week. I remember I got to this bed, and there was a guy, and he was in the 5th of the 46, and he was from the company that I had been resupplying the day that I got shot. And so I had to stop and talk to him. It was absolutely, I couldn't avoid talking to him. So I said, okay, what happened to you? And he said, well, I got shot through the leg. And he said he was in a foxhole. So I don't know exactly how he got shot through the leg, but there were a lot of ways for that to happen. And he said, it's just been a tough time for me. He said, I got to my unit about a week and a half ago, and he said I had a tough time getting there because on the first flight of that I was supposed to get there, I was on this helicopter and the pilot got shot, and I'm going like, okay, you're kidding me. He says, no, the pilot got shot. Well, when a pilot got shot, even if it was from another unit, everybody knew about it. Okay, it was not a secret, and there was no other pilot who had gotten shot besides me. So we got to talking, and sure enough, he was on board my. He was the only person on board my helicopter when I got shot. I remember he told me. He said, when I started hearing, the rounds coming at us or the fire, the guy shooting at us, I laid out flat on the floorboard because I know that these helicopters have armor plating. And I didn't tell him, but he just made a huge target out of himself. All the armor plating was around the pilot seats. There was none anywhere else other than the crew chief and gunner sat on an armored plate, like a seat cushion. So that was an amusing sort of thing to have happen. Interesting. I've never forgotten. I don't think I could say anything else other than it was overall a bad experience being in the hospital. I didn't ever want to be in an Army hospital again.
And I wanted to ask sort of a quick follow-up there, just, because I'm a child of television and movies, and I remember watching MASH and everything, even back in that time. Was there anything about that show that approximated any reality that you went through?
MASH the movie. Okay. I saw MASH the movie when I was in advanced flight training. And I saw it in a military theater with other guys. And we all laughed and carried on because it was exactly like Army life. And once I got in the hospital, it was exactly like being in a MASH. I mean, I go into that operating room, there's doctors everywhere working on people who are horribly wounded. I'm smoking a cigarette, in the operating room. Just everything about it, the guy that was high on heroin that set me up on my butt and told me about all the girls he'd had sex with. uh, he's going to float me down there. Another experience I had that I didn't tell you about, as I was going back, I was waiting on the doctor to come examine my stitches. And there was another doctor, and they had a guy who was asleep. And he had an injury on the back of his neck. His neck was cut open from about the base of his neck all the way up onto the back of his head. It was about 6 inches long. And the doctor said, he said, I want you to take a needle and stitches here now and sew this man's neck up. So the guy began to sew the neck up. And I'm just sitting there waiting. And as he sewed it up, if you started buttoning up his shirt and you started on the wrong button, and when you get down to the last button, you realize you've made a mistake and it's off kilter, and maybe so that's kind of like what he had done. He hadn't got it evenly sewn up, and we got down to the bottom. There was this kind of bulging place where he couldn't get it to work to sew it up evenly. And the doctor came back about that time. He says, "What have you done? What have you done? You cut all those stitches out and sew him up again." Good grief! I'm glad that's not me. I don't ever want to be put to sleep again in an Army hospital. Think about how sore that poor guy's neck must have been after that, and he would never know why. So yeah, just like MASH. just like MASH.
Okay, I was curious about that. And I also always like to ask the question about movies that were made that eventually represent this era. Was there any movie that you ever watched that felt really captured your time?
Yes, there was one, and it was based on a book. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and the movie was called We Were Soldiers. And I read that book, or and finally I got up the courage to go see the movie, because even though this was like the year 2000 or 2001 when I saw that movie, I wasn't sure how it would affect me. I didn't. I would flinch when I saw people get shot. I would get a pain in both of my legs, which at when I saw somebody get shot, it was very uncomfortable. And this had been 30 years later. But so I got up the courage to go see the movie, and I went to see it with my wife and my son and one of his friends, and it was actually a guy I went to school with. He was friends with that guy, and that movie took me right back. I'm telling you, it just took me right back. It was so um, it was just it was uh, the best movie I've ever seen that captured exactly, or just it showed exactly the way things were. There wasn't it was take compare it to Platoon, for example. I don't know if you've seen Platoon, but Platoon was not so bad, except they crammed everything that ever happened to any unit in Vietnam all into one movie, like it all happened to that unit, and it just didn't happen that way. Um, Probably one of the better ones was Full Metal Jacket. Uh, it was fairly good, but not anything like We Were Soldiers. The first movie that I ever saw when I got back from Vietnam, it was in the late 1970s. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I went to see the Deer Hunter. And I don't know why I didn't walk out of that movie. I was when it was over, I was really in a different world. That again was not it was not as reflective of reality as I would have hoped it would have been. But scenes of the guy with the pistol up to his head playing Russian roulette. We had a guy in our unit died that way. We had two suicides, and he was one of them. So some of those things were realistic, and those things did happen to guys. It's just I can't really say much other than it. I was very disturbed when I got out, and I never went back to see it again. The other thing I would say about movies is there was a movie about it was called Hunting Private Ryan, and see what was Saving Private Ryan. That's what it was. Um, the scene when they landed at D-Day on the beach, and the bullets were hitting the uh, the obstacles and things like that, and hitting the water around them. I I just wanted to get up and leave. It was like I was in combat again. So that was a very realistic movie, even though it was about World War II. It was very disturbing for me or anyone else who had ever been in combat. Let me tell you,
Yeah.
very disturbing.
I mean, it was I happened to see Saving Private Ryan when that came out with a D-Day veteran, because there was a guy that I knew really well and he wanted to see it, and
Mm,
it was an intense experience. He was a Navy guy, so he was up
mm-hmm,
for it. Wasn't what he exactly went through. Uh,
mm-hmm.
but talk about a powerful
Yeah,
couple of hours just sitting
yeah.
back with him. One other movie I wanted to ask you about, and I swear this won't all be pop culture, but that's kind of my
Okay.
experience in a way. But as a
Mm-hmm.
as a chopper pilot, did you ever see Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, I certainly did. There's so many things that came out of that movie. Uh, I think if you, I mean, I think something like that could have actually happened. But the only thing that I looked at as it being realistic was there was a scene when the guys were on a boat going up a river to get to where the colonel was, and they got hit by enemy fire and they were returning fire. Um, that was pretty realistic and fairly disturbing to me. The rest of it was just more like a really sad story.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, it was almost more of a parable in many ways.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
You know, it was something that you learned lessons from. It was not something that was necessarily realistic to situations in Vietnam.
Okay.
There were people who deserted, or there were people who did weird things. Don't get me wrong; they were out there. We used to see white guys out in the AO with. We saw a white guy with red hair. Now, whether he was American or Russian or where he came from, I don't know, but he was out with the enemy, and so we were all gunning for him. So it. There were strange things that did happen over there.
Okay. You said AO. What does that stand for?
Sorry, area of operation.
Okay. Okay. Curious. I wanted to ask another question about something you said during your rehab time. You talked about the soldier that you ran into who was on heroin, and that's a part of the Vietnam experience as well. Do you remember seeing a lot of that during the time you were there?
No, there wasn't a lot of that. The majority of that was towards was in 19 late 1970, 1971, and maybe 1972. It became very prevalent and easy to get access to the heroin and I forget the drug that heroin comes from. Morphine, not morphine. What you get those from? Anyhow, the base drug you get those from. They would raise it uh, in Vietnam, and they would raise the plants that they would get it from, and then poppy plants, and they would bring it on the people who came on post, the Vietnamese who came on post to work would sneak it on post to guys who wanted it. And then another thing I would see when I was flying uh, a mission called Night Perimeter Patrol, where I would fly around the Chu Lai perimeter all night long, making sure we weren't being attacked, by people trying to crawl through the wire. I did see people who were in the bunkers, American soldiers who were in the bunkers, going out to the wire and on the side of the base that was it had the highway ran right down the base, Highway 1, and right across that was a village. And the guys would go over to the wire and things were exchanged through the wire. I saw that happen. So that was probably drug exchanges. Um, marijuana, marijuana grew wild there. I mean, it was everywhere. and it was very prevalent. Smoking marijuana was so common that I don't know of anybody who ever got in trouble for it. And we would go and do what was called health and welfare inspections. They'd pick a couple of officers, warrant officers, and they'd say, "Okay, go over to the enlisted men's barracks and check everybody's locker and stuff like that, and make sure they don't have any drugs." Well, the guys would just leave it open in the hooches. If they had some marijuana, they didn't hide it. They left it right and open. That way, it was you didn't know who it belonged to. There was nothing you could do but confiscate it. So, yeah, that's about all I can say about drugs, really. I heard of some people getting acid sent to them from the states, but doing something like that, in my opinion, would be just absolutely stupid because um, you needed to have your wits together to some extent, and that would be you'd be witless for a long period of time if you did that. So, but I don't think that was really common.
And I saw a movie not too long ago, The Greatest Beer Run Ever. Did you happen to see it?
No.
Okay. It's an interesting one. It might be something you'd like to check out. It's sort of about a group of friends in New York City. One goes to, or several went to Vietnam. One of the guys was a merchant mariner, and he decided he wanted to bring beer to his friends in Vietnam. And it's based on a true story. It's a thing that actually happened, which is kind of cool. But what kind of beer would you guys get access to, and how often? I remember seeing that image the donut dolly showed last week of the Black Label.
Carling Black Label, Schlitz, and Pabst Blue Ribbon. That's what we were able to get. Um, and if we went to the PX, that's what was available. And it had been sitting on pallets in the heat for long periods of time. Uh, Same thing with cigarettes. Cigarettes were sealed in plastic, the cartons were, but I don't know how old they were. All I know was when I first walked off the airplane, there were guys sitting there, and they were just sitting there talking. Everybody that walked by, they'd say, "Got any stateside cigarettes? Got any stateside cigarettes?" And of course, we all did if we smoked, and they would try to talk us out of some of them. So there was a pretty big difference, apparently. I just smoked cigarettes. I didn't. I was addicted to uh, nicotine. I didn't care what it tasted like too much.
It's sort of a side question there, because of course, for a lot of World War II vets, many became addicted during the war. And I mean, as you know, smoking killed a lot of those guys way more than the war ever did. Did the Army supply cigarettes directly to you guys, or was it more so something you got on your own?
You could get them on your own from the PX, but in C rations, every unit of C rations had a little pack of some type of cigarette, and I think it had. I don't know if it had 4 cigarettes or 6 cigarettes. I think it was 4. Just a little small package, a little cardboard carton, and you never knew what kind of cigarettes you were going to get. But basically, each type of C rations had usually the same kind of cigarette in it. So if there were cartons of C rations available, somebody would generally come along and snitch all the Marlboros out of them, or maybe all the Winstons out of them, and the only thing that would be left would be Pell Mell. And so my roommate, he smoked Pell Mell, non-filtered cigarettes. So when Pell Mells were left, I would gather them up and take them to him. He was happy as a lark, and I had to smoke them a few times myself. The other thing I'd say about cigarettes is if you didn't keep your cigarettes hidden real well, we had Vietnamese women who would come on post, and they would polish your boots, sweep up the floor in your room, and wash your clothes, and steal your cigarettes. So um, you had to kind of keep your cigarettes hidden, or you would be relieved of them. I my A lot of the girls would leave their pocketbooks in my hooch for some reason or other. I guess they trusted us, and I opened up my hooch maid's pocketbook one day when she wasn't there. She was out somewhere else in another room, and my goodness, it was full of cigarettes, all kinds of different cigarettes that she had stolen from us guys that she was working for. One hooch maid usually worked for about 4 different rooms, so that was about 8 guys, and we paid them $30 a month, all 4 of us. All 4 rooms would pay them about $30 a month, and they would almost kill for those jobs because these poor people had been brought in from out in other areas of Vietnam and put into this local village where they didn't have any way of surviving. They didn't have any money. The only thing they could do was work for the U.S. government on post, and they were very resentful of that. I don't blame them. I don't blame them at all.
So let me ask a follow-up there, because this is something I've heard a number of other vets mention. I mean, obviously those people are using the cigarettes on the outside as a form of currency and whatever.
Yes.
Did you ever run into a situation where local people were coming on base and doing work for you guys where anybody turned out to be Viet Cong or anything like that?
Well, I'm that was pretty common, though I wasn't personally involved in knowing anybody like that. Um, but it wasn't that unusual to find somebody pacing off uh, locations, distances in locations. So you would I would let me say this: if we were going to have a rocket attack, you generally knew because the Vietnamese people that worked on base wouldn't show up that day. They knew. They knew. They weren't necessarily VC, but they knew. And a lot of those people were VC. They had to have a job too. So yeah, they came and worked on post, and in the daytime and fought us at night.
Okay.
The American Army should never have allowed these people on post, but the way they took care of that in later years, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, they hired civilian contractors to do that kind of work. That way, you didn't have to have as many military people.
Yeah.
But yeah, some of those people that came on post were really nice, and I liked them. The woman that cleaned my room, she and I would go as far to say we were friends.
Excellent. So stories about Vietnam. I mean, I kind of want to follow you to a degree because you told me a ton of stuff last time, and
Mm-hmm.
I made a few notes. I didn't make as many as I should have, unfortunately. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I remember everything that you got into last week, and I don't think that you were following a specific chronology necessarily.
Yeah,
So I'll
I
kind of follow
tried to.
your lead.
I tried to, but it didn't work out because one thing would make me jump to something that was out of order.
Yeah, which is totally fine. I mean, storytelling can be chronological. It can also be a little bit more thematic, and I think the stream of consciousness thing is kind of interesting,
Mm-hmm.
actually, sometimes. So I can kind of follow your lead and where you want to go. One thing that might be interesting would be to look perhaps through some of the photos that you sent me, if there were any
Mm-hmm.
particular ones that you wanted to comment on.
Mm-hmm.
You want me to?
We can do that.
Okay, let me go ahead and open that email that you sent just earlier today. I do see that obviously the first few that come up, and I'll do share screen in a moment, look like they have to do with Reginald Cleve. I see the memorial marker, and it looks like a number
Mm-hmm.
of you guys came together to do a memorial for him. So in the email that you had sent me earlier, you included the names, I think it was of 16 men, if I remember correctly, in your unit that were killed or who died during the war. Would he be one of the names that came up in that same email?
Yes, there was. I think there was 36 or 38 guys somewhere in that neighborhood that got killed, and there were 8 of them killed while I was there. That I no nine. Let's see. Wait a minute. 2 full crews is 8, and then Butch was 9. Oh, 10. There was 10 I can think of right off the top of my head that were killed while I was there.
And are there stories that that you wanted to share about any of those?
Yes. I had, when I was talking before, I was trying, like I say, to go in order, but I noticed that I didn't exactly. So I made some notes so I could do a little bit better job of that. And what I talked about making aircraft commander, I think, but I didn't say about how I got the call sign Minuteman 27. And I wanted to talk about um, a friend of mine. He stayed in the same hooch that I was in, and we used to sit outside and talk a lot. Several of us would, and one of the guys in my room had a monkey named Mary Ann, or in my hooch had a monkey named Mary Ann, and I could tell you a lot of stories about that. But we would sit outside and talk, and the monkey would run around on a leash. This one guy was Butch Sears, and he was Minuteman 27. He was an aircraft commander. He was a relatively new aircraft commander when I was there, and as I became a little more experienced, then I flew with him some. Very, very nice guy. Uh, the monkey loved him, I guess, was what I would say there. The monkey would sit on his shoulder and go through his hair and pick out anything that was in his hair, a piece of dandruff or anything, but would preen him. Um, so Butch was flying with a guy who was up for aircraft commander. He was a pilot, but he was about ready to make aircraft commander, and to do that, you had to fly with every aircraft commander in your flight or platoon. We called them flights instead of platoons, and you had to be every aircraft commander had to sign off that you were ready to be an aircraft commander. And Butch was flying in the right seat, and the pilot was flying in the left seat, which was reversal. So the pilot could show that he was capable of flying, from the left seat, which was a different perspective. And they sat down on the ground to deliver some resupply, and a sniper shot Butch in the jaw. And they the pilot flew him back to the hospital. And we got ready the next morning, I was going to go over to visit Butch. And as we were trying to find a vehicle to take us over there, some guys came back from the hospital and said Butch was dead. He had apparently had a blood clot go to his brain during the night, and it killed him. And so then we were short an aircraft commander, so then they decided to make me an aircraft commander. And they said I had to take that call sign, Minuteman 27. And I fought as hard as I could not to take that call sign, because he was my friend. And then on top of that, he was so well known by the troops that he resupplied. They would, a lot of times we would resupply the same units, so they would know your call sign maybe. But with Butch, it was different, because he would call a unit on the radio, and he would say, "This is Minuteman." He would go bark, 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 bark. Oh, my throat's a little scratchy, but bark, bark, bark. He would do the Chicken Man call from the cartoon on TV, and he'd say, "Chicken Man," and then he'd call the unit on the ground. "This is Minuteman 27 en route to your location with resupply. Pop smoke, please," or something like that. Pop a smoke. So because of that Chicken Man call, he was known for with every unit that he resupplied. And I just couldn't imagine resupplying these same units and telling them that Minuteman 27 was en route with resupply, and they would come back with the reply, "Chicken Man," which is what was commonly would happen. I couldn't stand the thought of that happening. So I didn't want that call sign, but I got stuck with it. And eventually I became very proud to have the same call sign that he had. But that took a long, long time. So that was one of the things that I wanted to follow up on, in that line of things. And then what I'd like to do is jump back to when I was first in Vietnam. And I would like to say that by the time I had a couple of months under my belt, I was extremely disappointed in what we were doing in Vietnam. I was horrified by what we were doing in Vietnam. War is horrifying, but my hoochmaid was at that time was a young girl, and I say young girl, they looked like they were 14, 15 years old, but probably were, early 20s. But she said, I asked her, why was she so unhappy about us being there? And she had said she wished we would go home. And so when you have someone like that tell you wish you go home, you ask them, well, why? We thought, we were helping. And I remember she said to me that she had lived out in the countryside somewhere, and that they had pigs and chickens, and they farmed, and they weren't reliant on anybody else. They took care of themselves. They lived in a village where they knew everybody, and we declared their area enemy territory, and we flew over there with helicopters playing recordings telling them, that if they were VC, they would get, and they gave up, what we call chuhoi, then they would be treated okay. And if they didn't give up, we would come in there and kill them. And we moved all of the people out of the area. If you didn't, we moved everybody out. And if they didn't come out, we considered everybody that was left the enemy, and we would go out of our way to kill them. So there they were. These people were forced to live in villages that were mostly made up of people who were pulled in from their homes. They were in the provincial headquarters at Quang Nai. There was what we call the Tin Ville right outside of Chu Lai, where I was. And it was called the Tin Ville because these people made their living quarters out of their houses. They made them out of pieces of tin, or beer cans opened up and flattened out, Coke cans opened out and flattened out. They used as siding, and they literally didn't have any way to make a living, and they worked on post because of that. And she wasn't happy. I'm telling you, she wasn't happy with us being there. And that's when I became disappointed. And I decided that I had to have a reason for staying there. And I knew that I went home every night, almost every night, and I slept in a hooch. And I had a mess hall that I could go to and eat. And if I didn't have a mess hall, that if I couldn't, I had C rations, or I had been to the PX and I had sardines and various things like that, or maybe they were sent from home. But I wasn't sleeping in a foxhole. worried about the enemy attacking me during the night. Yeah, would the enemy attack us on post? Yeah, they would. But it was a huge post. It wasn't like I was out with a platoon or squad and we were trying to contact the enemy. It wasn't anything like that. So I decided that I would do anything that I could do. That those guys, anything they asked me to do, I would do it to try to make their life easier. And that's how I lived out the rest of my life in Vietnam. I I never refused to do anything the guys asked me to do. The only thing I ever refused to do, I had a lieutenant colonel wanted me to go down on the ground so he could shake a commander's hand on the ground and thank him for the job he had done. And I probably would have killed us all if I'd have done that. And he didn't seem to understand that. But I finally convinced him that we shouldn't land on the ground. So I made a low pass where he could wave at him and salute him. So yeah, it was a difficult year because I didn't believe in what we were doing there. The only thing I believed in was doing whatever I had to keep Americans alive and come back home. That was it.
Let me ask a follow-up there, if you don't mind, because what you just said there reminded me an awful lot of a vet I met through the VBC last year who did a class presentation. And he talked about going over, I think he went over in 69, I think he was 69, 70, if I remember correctly. And he said at the beginning, he's 18 years old, out of high school, joined up. Dad was in World War II, and he fully accepted the
Gung ho, ready to go.
And he totally accepted the explanation of the domino theory and fighting for his country. What did you think in the early going? Did you believe all that stuff, that you had this mission?
I was from an area where people wanted to serve their country. I felt obligated to serve my country in some way or other. And then you go through basic training, and it's blood, blood, blood makes the grass grow. Kill, kill, kill without mercy. And you're trained into that sort of thing. They taught us in basic training about the domino theory, and we had they got us motivated to go over there and kill. And I got over there and was immediately demotivated. I never really wanted to kill anybody. I was glad I was a helicopter pilot. And I could only say is I don't care how you felt about not killing people. When someone else starts shooting at you and they're trying to kill you, and you can see bullets coming up at you, the tracers, it's not hard to return fire. Okay, you want to return fire, but I did not believe in what we were doing. Later on in life, I began to develop opinions. I read an awful lot about Vietnam, how things transpired, why Ho Chi Minh was aligned with the communists. He should have been aligned with us. We refused to support him, so he went to the communists. Things could have been different. Things could have been better. I didn't believe in the domino theory later in life. You look at what we have today. Countries align with other countries for a lot of different reasons. And I was just completely disappointed in what the United States was doing there. And the older I got and the more I read about the Vietnam War, the process that happened between World War II and Vietnam, including Korea, I'm very anti-war. If we got attacked, like 9/11 or something like that happened, I will go fight to protect my country. But to go over and do what we did in Vietnam, look at what we did in Afghanistan. Wrong, wrong, wrong. What we did at first was terrific. We went in there and we accomplished the mission. We didn't get Osama bin Laden, but but we went in there and we kicked butt and we stopped. You know, those guys. We didn't. We they didn't have a place to plan their missions and stuff and attack us anymore. And then we should have gotten out. Yes, I sympathize with Afghanistan. I sympathize with the people there. But you can go back as far as you want to in history. And anybody ever tried to go in there and invade that country got their butt kicked. And we did too. History repeats itself. So, I mean, Iraq, we invaded Iraq for all the wrong reasons. It's just ever since World War II, I have not agreed with what the American military has done. We've gone all over the world, the CIA, and undermined countries, did everything we could to. Well, it's getting kind of political at this point. Well, let's just say I don't feel real good about the United States and what we have done as a country since World War. I don't have a good feeling of what we have done as a country since 1776 or even prior to that. You know, I'm embarrassed about what happened with native peoples here, though a lot died because of illnesses, you know. But look at what we did out west with the buffalo. We killed all the buffalo, you know, so they wouldn't have anything to eat. Then look at slavery, you know. So, yeah, I love my country, but I'm ashamed of a lot of the things that my country has done. I'm probably not what you'd call a political conservative, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
So
I think I
all of
understand.
that came later. But when I went over there, yeah, I was gung ho until the first 2 months, until after about the first 2 months.
That's very similar to what I mentioned that other vet talking about. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
he very quickly discovered that he wasn't necessarily there to fight, for the United States, but he very quickly came to realize he was there to fight for his fellow soldiers. And that's
Exactly.
what the mission was.
Exactly.
So let me ask a related question to everything you were just talking about. I guess what year again was it that you came back, Carl? Was it 71?
71. I came back in July of 71. Yes.
So it's not so long after that that the news about My Lai started to come out. Do you remember learning about that?
Oh, well, yes, after I came back. Now, let me go back on that. The area of operation, our AO, included My Lai. And guys that I know remember flying Cali or remember flying other people that were there to investigate what happened. And I worked that area extensively. Um, it was the peninsula there was one of the worst bad guy territories that there was, and the Americal division was formed from a group of aviation units that were part of the First Aviation Brigade, and infantry units that some of them were part of the 101st Airborne, and they put them all together, and it was called Operation. I'd have to look it up. I can't remember what they call it now off the top of my head. But anyhow, it was to assault this peninsula where all the enemy were, and then they established the base at Chulai, and they changed this what was an operational group. They changed it to a division, the Americal division, formed up out of the United States, just like it was in World War II, formed up out of the United States. So we were the only division like that. And that area in the Batangan Peninsula, part of it was uh, the Pinkville area, and that's where Callie's unit went in and killed so many civilians. And let me say one other thing about that. What Callie did, and his troops did, was absolutely horrifying and wrong. There was no reason for that. Can I understand why it was done? Absolutely. I don't condone it. I would never do it. I'm very happy there was a helicopter pilot that stopped it. But I understand it because even this happened before I got there to my unit, to the Marical Division. I think it happened. It was 1969, maybe. I don't remember exactly what year. But when I got there in 70 and 71, one of the biggest areas that we medevaced out of was that particular area, that Pinkville area. There were booby traps. It wasn't people getting shot. It was people stepping on booby traps. And I can't tell you all the stories that happened while I was there, medevacing people out of there. So our troops would walk into a village, and trying to get in there, they would find booby traps, they would trip booby traps. And the people that lived in that village, mostly old men and women and children, not anybody that was combat age. The people that lived there, they weren't stepping on those booby traps. So why weren't they stepping on those booby traps? Because they knew where they were, because they were the ones putting them there. And so if you never get to contact the enemy, if you only have very short, brief incursions with the enemy, but your guys are getting blown up constantly by booby traps, you're wanting to stop that from happening. And they were so infuriated. This was a unit of the 11th Brigade, I think it was. They were out of Duck Faux, which was a town south of Chulai. They were so frustrated that they did those horrifying things, and it should never have happened. It was a massacre, and Callie did his time for doing it, but he was kind of the fall guy. His company commander was guilty of overlooking things. So horrible incident. And then the other thing I would say about my division, we had a black eye because of that, but we also had a black eye for using Agent Orange after it was banned. And so, those were two things that happened. Otherwise, I think we were a pretty good division, and we were effective, and we were in Southern I Corps. One of the company commanders that was in the Marical Division when he was a captain became Secretary of the Army. One of the commanders that was there was Schwarzkopf, and these were good guys. And I can't remember. Colin Powell was a captain in the Marical Division, and these guys came back. They were career Army officers, and they did everything they could to change the Army so that it wasn't like it was in Vietnam. They did a lot of things to improve the Army, make it better. And look at what Schwarzkopf did. I mean, he wasn't playing games. He wasn't putting up with. He was going in there with full force to win. something that we did not do in Vietnam. Not as a country. As individual units, yes, but not as a country. And so we had our hands tied all the time. After um, after Callie's incident, they declared all kind of no fire zones, and we weren't allowed to return fire unless the volume of fire was intense enough to shoot us down, or maybe not even return fire at all. And we would have to call and get permission to return fire. So we were restricted, of what we could do. So I always said, I got shot, and the guy fired about a clip at me, and only one round hit the aircraft, and that round hit me. So my instructions to my crew in a controlled fire zone, where you could only return fire if the volume of fire was intense enough to shoot you down. My instructions were, that is one round. That's all it takes. If somebody pot shots at us, you pot shot back. If they open up on us, you open up on them in return. That was always my instructions to my crew. And I didn't have but a couple of crew members who, if you told them to go hot, they would try to shoot every hooch and everybody around that they could. Most of them were very serious. They were very good, and they would return fire on the target that they could see, or best as they could, because you could see tracers, at night. In the daytime, you could see muzzle flashes. And those guys, they had their eyes open, and they were ready to fight. We had excellent crew members on our helicopters, what we called the Gibbs, the guys in back. We were the Gifts, and they were the Gibbs.
Very good. I got to keep up with all those acronyms.
Guys in front, guys in back.
And let me just ask you one more thing today, Carl, because I do got to do some stuff outside today, and we can do a part 3 of this. I'm in no way, shape, or form in a hurry, but obviously you talk about your changing attitudes and coming back to the United States. Were you involved in any anti-war activities on your return?
No, I was in right near Savannah, Georgia, and there was no anti-war activity there. There was two big military bases right near there. It was Hunter Army Airfield, and there was Fort Stewart, which is the largest artillery base, I think, maybe in the country, or at least east of the Mississippi. Very huge base, and nobody was really anti-military. Everybody kind of had the attitude, like I did, to serve your country. So there wasn't anything like that going on. People didn't talk about Vietnam. That was pretty much nationwide. I mean, it was an unpopular war. And so we didn't tell people we served in the war. People didn't ask us about it. So no, I didn't. If I had been in other places, I probably still wouldn't have participated, because I didn't really become angry about it. I was disappointed. My heart was just not in it, but I was not intensely angry about it until years later, as I learned the history of what went on. I read extensively about Vietnam.
Did you read A Bright Shining Lie?
I may have. It doesn't jump out there. I've read so many books on Vietnam. I've got 2 bookcases full of Vietnam books. So it's hard to say. Certain ones do stand out. There was a fellow named Stanton who wrote some very, very detailed books on the war, and I read him a couple of books that he wrote, um, just anything I could get my hands on that was history. I read reports about that the Air Force wrote about our invasion of Laos, Lamson 719, when my friend got killed. And I read the Air Force reports about how they warned the Army that in Laos they had all these anti-aircraft positions, and if we didn't fly differently than what we were flying in South Vietnam, that we were going to get our asses shot off, and we did. We didn't pay any attention to the Air Force. Our Army leaders poo-pooed it, and we did a lot of things wrong. And aviation units that took in the South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese paid a big price for it.
Yeah, in that whole region, just absolute chaos in the years following.
I want to make one comment. When I first made contact with you and I saw what you were doing, I didn't understand what was happening, and it didn't take me very long to figure out you're teaching history. It's that simple, and this is just fabulous what I see you doing here. Not only you're teaching young people the realities of what war is like, and what it was like in history. You did World War II. Now you're doing Vietnam. You're interviewing people who experienced all this. Now you're doing the civil rights movement. My hat's off to you.
Yeah, it's
My
enjoyable.
hat is off to you.
I think it's important for the students to meet these people. To the students 50 years ago, might as well have been 500 years ago. But we know better, and
Yeah.
I just think it's an important thing for them to do.
I thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I appreciate
Not
that.
not just about Vietnam, but all of this. I thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah,
You're a tremendous history teacher.
well, I will keep doing it. I got a few more years left in me, and I'm gonna do it as long as I can.